Hello, my name's Olu Osha. I'm continuing my discussion on American presidents, and this is a footnote to my ongoing analysis. So, right now, I'm discussing the transition from indentured servitude to slavery prior to the Declaration of Independence. Now, the last thing I mentioned in a prior video, I titled this particular series um, "Black and White Slaves in Colonial America." So I've done a first part, and this is the second part. So I ended the first part by mentioning that the first uh, person in the English colonies who um, who was enslaved as punishment for a crime. The crime being that he escaped his captors and he was subsequently captured, and his penalty was to serve the rest of his natural life as a slave. So I had mentioned that that person, John Punch, turned out to be uh, the ancestor of our 44th president and first black president, President Barack Obama, through his mother, through his white mother, right? Um, I'm going to discuss. I don't want to discuss my favorite American presidents like Barack Obama, but I might just give. I will talk about another video in which I just talk about his ancestry and his biography, which of course, because he's a recent president, we virtually all know. So yeah, John Punch, through historical records and DNA analysis, is it is there's a strong likelihood that he was the 11th great grandfather of maternal great grandfather of President Barack Obama. The history is very interesting, isn't it? So while John Punch was recorded to have been the first person to have been enslaved by reason of a crime, as a punishment for a crime in the English colonies, the first person to have been legally recognized as a slave through a civil court was a guy called John Casser, right? And this was from a 1655 case. Interestingly, John Casser, of course, he had been an indentured servant as well. He'd been an indentured servant to, interestingly, an African man who had been an indentured servant himself, and he was now free. Remember, indentured servitude had uh, a limited term, so it had an expiration date, unlike slavery, which came later on. Slavery was for life, no expiration date, and through subsequent laws including Partus Sequitur Ventrum, the children of an enslaved woman became slaves as well. So slavery was for life, and the children of an enslaved woman would become slaves as well. So racial slavery would start, but this was later on, and this was what set the precedent in a civil suit. So um, a guy called Anthony Johnson, who was from Angola, he was an African who had been an indentured slave. He had been an indentured servant. And there's a difference between slave and indentured servant. And after he served his time, and as an indentured servant, and he became free, he went on to become a wealthy man. He acquired land, as much as 500 acres of land in the Virginia colony, and so he he had, at this time, he actually had five indentured servants himself, and he grew tobacco. Four of his indentured servants were actually white men. So he had white men who were his indentured servants. So yeah, so you can see that the uh, the notions of race and property and class, and these developed over time in the American colonies with the institutionalization of chattel slavery, right, which racialized slavery. And of course, so uh, Anthony Johnson, who was an African from Angola, um, previously an indentured servant, won his freedom. He had now amassed some land himself. He had about 500 acres of land, and amongst his indentured servants were four white men, and then he had uh, one black man, an African slave by the name of John Kaser. He was an indentured servant initially. Now, so there was a dispute between John Kaser and Anthony Johnson. John Kaser contended that that he had served his term as an indentured servant. He had servant to Anthony Johnson. He had completed and exceeded his term, and that he should have been free. That he was supposed to be a free man, and so he left his service. He left his employer, right, and went to another man, a white man by the name of Robert Parker, and he explained this to Robert Parker, and he agreed to become Robert Parker's indentured servant. However, Anthony Johnson did not agree, and so he went to file a lawsuit. It was called a freedom suit um, at the court of Northampton, which was in the Virginia colony. So he filed a suit saying that uh, John Kasser was his indentured servant, and initially he lost, but eventually he filed an appeal, and in the same court he won. And interestingly, this court now recognized John Kasser as the life servant, right, as a life servant to uh, to Anthony Johnson. So that was what established life life servitude within the civil system. Of course, again, prior to Africans prior to the John Kasser's instance had been held in different situations as life servants, but as punishment for a crime. And the other thing is that the Africans, of course, they were illiterate. They couldn't read. They could barely understand English. So many times the planter, if it was a white planter or even a black planter, they might deceive them and continue to hold them in perpetual servitude. And remember, I'd mentioned in the earlier video that with the termination of the indenture servitude, right? um, the term of service, the employer was required to give the now free former servant uh, freedom dues. That's provide him with a plot of land, provide him with a gun, some materials, clothing, so that he could start off on his own. But while this was provided to white indentured servants when they became free, this did not happen for the Africans. The Africans were often denied this, so many of them continued on as informally as indentured servants, for the rest of their lives for the white planters or a black planter like Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson was a black man who had started off as an indentured servant, and eventually he was able to, when he became free, he was able to acquire servants, on his own as well. And by the way, there was something called head rights. So head rights allowed, if because the initial colonies, right, they were trying to populate the to grow the population of the colonies. So head rights gave uh, awarded land um, to individuals who could go and acquire indentured servants, laborers to come and work the land. And so they would give them extra land. And this was something that Anthony Johnson did. He went to go and acquire, uh, laborers, indentured servants for himself, and he was awarded land. So this was prior to later laws that were now instituted in Maryland and Virginia and the southern states that now started to create racial slavery and chattel slavery. So this was the situation, and we see after this case in 1655, which created the first legally recognized slave who was an African, not a white person, they started to create other laws, right? And because there was also there was the thorny issue of white and black indentured servants collaborating to run away or cause rebellions, like in the case of um, John Punch and his white collaborators, a Dutch man and a Scotsman, who all escaped. But when they were caught, they had uh, different penalties. They faced different penalties based on race. The two white men were given, their term of service were, they just extended their terms of service, gave them 4 years more of indentured servitude, while the black man, the African, John Punch, would get life, the rest of his life as a slave. He'd face the rest of his natural life as a slave. So you see, the terms of service were different. Now, so these colonies, the English colonies in the Americas, started to gradually institute laws that racialized servitude and created chattel slavery and made sure that the whites and blacks indentured servants did not collaborate together. Now, it was often a problem when if whites formerly indentured servants went off and they weren't successful, they couldn't get land, or the their their former employers had defrauded them, right? Their former owners, in the indentured servitude contract had defrauded them. So they created, they created problems in the colonies, and especially including the blacks. So there were now restrictive laws that were created. Um, Now, I'd mentioned earlier one of the laws that were created. The first anti-miscegenation laws that were passed in the state of Maryland in 1664, which prohibited black men from marrying English women, that's white women, and the punishment was enslavement. Now, English common law did not allow for the enslavement of um, of English people, of white people, of Christians. That's how they call them, right? Baptized Christians, and so you can see it was supposed to be a deterrent, right, to deter uh, blacks and whites from intermarrying, because now chattel slavery was now starting. Uh, but something that happened though was that the children of this mixed marriages, right, the children of mixed marriages were held as indentured servants, right, for a term period of 30 years, right? If the child had a white mother and a black father, so they could be held as indentured servants for a period of 30 years. Now, there's something interesting that I wanted to mention. So you see, earlier on, prior to the 1662 law of partus sequitur ventrum, which meant that children inherited the slave status of their mothers, and that institutionalized chattel slavery based on race, only based on the race of Africans, because English law did not allow. So under English common law, children followed the status of their fathers, right? But they created a new law in the colonies, which was an old Roman law that was different from English law, right? So to ensure that the Africans, because the Africans were continued to be viewed as foreigners, right? So they started to change the rules. They viewed the Africans as foreigners, the black people as foreigners, not citizens of the colonies. This gradually, this gradually started to take root, and it started to establish chattel slavery of people of African descent. So um, something that we should note is, so if a black man, right, married uh, an English woman, a white woman, that would later on be a way for their children to be free, right? Because when the law was first created, that the child would take the status of their enslaved mother, of their mother, then it meant that an African, a black person marrying a black woman who's a slave ended up being having children who were enslaved as well. But if a black man, that was prior to the anti-miscegenation laws being passed, a black man married a white woman, an English woman, which it was not, which happened in the early colonies, then their children would be free. They would not be be enslaved. However, with the passing of that 1662 law, and then gradually so the penalty was for the woman to become an indentured servant, or they'd go to another colony, right? The penalty, if she married a black man, if the white woman married a black man, then the penalty was that their children, the woman could be an indentured servant for 5 years or so, and of course their children, or they could just leave and go to another colony where they'd be free, right? But of course there was an issue of resources. Um, so later on, the state of Maryland would now, not the state of Maryland, the Virginia colony would now start passing a lot of restrictive laws. So in 1699, Virginia passed a law deporting all free blacks, right? All free black people. All black people were required to leave the Virginia colony. Any black person who remained was enslaved, right? That was in 1699. So you can see the institutionalization of chattel slavery, how it started to take effect and separate the races, the black and whites. So in the beginning, when blacks and whites were both held as indentured servants, they were treated, with relative equality. Until I think the first distinction we notice in the colonies was with the penalty, the sentencing of um, John Punch for escaping, while his white collaborators were just, not. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. The indentured servitude was increased by 4 years, but that's John Punch. He got a punishment, a stiffer punishment of life servitude. So I think that's when we start to first notice uh, the difference in treatment between the black and white indentured servants, and this was in 1640. Um, so something that's interesting that I wanted to mention, there was the instance of a woman called Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth Key, in 1656, went to file a lawsuit for her freedom in Virginia, in the Virginia colony, and she was successful. She argued that because her mother was a black woman, was an African slave, but her father was an Englishman, a white Christian, and so she argued that because her father was a free Christian, and English common law forbids the forbade the enslavement of English Christians, right? That she should be free. So she won successfully, but that was prior to the codification of the Partus Sequitur Ventrum law, which required that the children of an enslaved that children inherit the slave status of their mothers, and of course, um, Elizabeth Key's mother, her African mother, had been a slave, so she should have been a slave. But she got her freedom prior to the passing of the law, which was in 1662. The reason I also mentioned Elizabeth Key is because it turns out She's the ancestor, eighth great great grandmother of the famous one and only Johnny Depp, who did Pirates of the Caribbean. One of my favorite actors, Johnny Depp. Yes, he is a descendant of uh, a black African, slave, and yeah, he so that is kind of interesting. You see the sort of facts you get to find out when you study history. So, slavery started to chattel slavery started to take effect in the English colonies, and uh, what else of significance happened? I talked about Anthony Johnson, who unfortunately was a black man, an African in himself. In fact, he was born in Africa, in Angola, and he went on to own slaves himself. Interesting. So he owned the first legally recognized slave under the law. Uh, who the first person who was legally recognized as a slave without having committed a crime. So that was John Casser, right? So John Casser, right? He's the first black person who was legally recognized as a slave in the English colonies without having committed a crime. And his owner was actually a black man, an African man, but who had initially been an indentured servant himself by the name of Anthony Johnson. So Anthony Johnson became rich, he became prosperous. He would move away from Virginia and move to the Somerset County of Maryland, and he acquired about over 300 acres more of land, planting tobacco. He had children. He had descendants, and he had a vineyard. His plantation was called Torrey's Vineyard, and it's interesting though that his property did not go to. They initially went to his heirs, but eventually they went to white people because chattel slavery, which he had helped create through his actions, would eventually dispossess black people wholesale. And so his property, his wealth would go on to be taken up by white people. Now, and so in the beginning, prior to the codification of these slave laws, slave codes, um, the formerly indentured African servants, once they became free, they went off to marry white women, right? And so their children often assimilated into white community, white society. So we see the ancestors of Johnny Depp, for instance, or we see the maternal ancestry of President Barack Obama, right? We know Anne Durham and her family as white people, but it turns out they had a black ancestor from the period of the early Virginia colonies, and Virginia and Maryland colonies. So yeah, John Punch was it Virginia? Yeah. So yeah. So and that's the interesting part of American history that we continue to grapple with. And of course, I was just recently reading that of course the state of Maryland, which I'm talking about, has they released an over 600 uh, page document regarding its Truth and Reconciliation Commission or so, to investigate lynchings that occurred between the Civil War era and the Second World War. Um, Generally, in America, particularly in the South, it's been estimated that between 4,000 to 6,500 black people, of course, mainly men, were lynched uh, in in the South, and of course, this was a legacy uh, of slavery, chattel slavery, and of course, chattel slavery crystallized the division of the races, the animus between the races. the discrimination and oppression of Black people here. And so it's kind of interesting, uh, an irony, sad that an African who was a victim of the system participated in the codification, the first legalization of the institution of slavery in the English colonies. That's Anthony Johnson, who had been an indentured servant born in Africa himself. He went on to own indentured servants himself, including white men who worked for him, of course, but they were freed. So they would free the white men when the terms of their indenture, their servitude was over. But for blacks, they would deceive the Africans who, they couldn't really speak the language, they weren't literate. And in the instance, for instance, the case of John Casser, and of course Anthony Johnson, he took advantage of the system because this was a system that the white patriarchy was invested in, and he went to court and he won. He defeated a white man in court. So using the legal system to legalize the life servitude of a fellow African man, John Caser, who became the first legally recognized slave in in the uh, in the English colonies without having committed a crime. I'm going to stop here. I want to keep the videos short, and I'll continue, um, my discussion, this footnote in uh, my analysis of American presidents. My name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents. I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, in which my rights have been violated. I was attacked through a swatting in Maryland by rogue cops, and I was a victim of a swatting in my own apartment. My constitutional rights were violated. The cops came like a lynch mob and they defamed me, spreading disinformation. All of this have occurred, and I'm seeking justice. The man who filed the fabricated petition that served as pretext for the cops coming to my home without an arrest warrant, without probable cause, who committed perjury, was Jide Iwarere, a Howard University professor. I don't know if he has dementia. Then the state should check if he has dementia because he's dangerous. He orchestrated events that could have led to my death. I survived an assassination attempt when about 40 white cops came, raided me, tased me in my home, shot me in the head. This is, I have stitches there, and they dehumanized me, removing me from my apartment, handcuffing me in a gurney, dumping me in a hospital when I was not sick. My family didn't know where I was. I was kidnapped just like a slave, just the way slaves were kidnapped. But the thing is, this had uh, it had limited duration, and the distance traveled was not comparable to the era of the transatlantic slave trade. But nevertheless, I was falsely imprisoned, abducted, assaulted, kidnapped, dehumanized in my apartment, and I'm yet to get justice. So add insult to injury. The police officers who assaulted me, injured me, almost killed me, then filed false charges, falsified their incident reports saying I was trying to harm people, which was a lie, complete fabrication. There's still no evidence of this. This never happened. And they now falsely accused me of having tried to assault them or assaulting them. This never happened either. I haven't had my day in court. The sad thing is, we have a corrupt judge in Montgomery County that has been supporting them, that has continued this charade, violating my constitutional rights. A crooked, racist, and xenophobic judge in Maryland by the name of Judge James Bonifant. And I'm seeking justice, and I'm hoping the American public, the international community, pays attention to the criminal conduct of Judge James Bonifant and the state attorney's office led by a crooked, racist, and xenophobic state attorney, John McCarthy, and his cohorts, his crooked cohorts, including Thea Zumwalt and a John David Lalos. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.